I'll be talking about other nations' efforts to regulate Canadian oil production. But my title is Petroleum and Pâté, and I realize that's a bit of a puzzle, but I hope the reasons for that will be clear by the time I get to the end of my presentation. So today I'd like to first talk about why there's so much focus on the Canadian oil industry in other countries, particularly the United States. Then I'll talk about how Canada's trading partners are trying to regulate Canadian oil production. I'll discuss the oil industry's policy case against these foreign regulations, and then I'll question whether the oil industry is making the legal case against these regulations. So, as Lauren mentioned, I'm an American, and so as a result, I guess as a representative of all Americans, I often get this question, some version of this question when I'm in Canada, and particularly Alberta, which is, if US regulators are so concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, why do they focus so much of their effort on those oil sands emissions, which are dwarfed by United States coal emissions? If you're concerned about greenhouse gases, why not focus on US coal emissions? And I typically hear two sort of pet theories of Canadians about why this might be. One theory is that, well, it's really just irrational, it's a passing insanity and it'll go away. And the other theory is, well, it's because Canada really hasn't adopted enough greenhouse gas regulations. So if they agreed to cut their emissions back a little bit, then that scrutiny on the oil sands would go away. And what both of those points of view have in common is that they suggest that this focus on the oil sands is just temporary. Right? It's just until better regulations are adopted or until this insanity passes. And what I'd like to suggest today is that that's not the case. In fact, foreign scrutiny on the oil sands is only likely to increase in coming years. And I'll talk a little bit about how that might manifest itself. So the main reason why scrutiny is likely only to continue to increase is because the groups that are driving that scrutiny are not looking to cut back all of these emissions just a little bit. They're not looking to have marginal reductions in each area. They're looking to cut back fossil fuel consumption as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible. So many times I find that Canadians are surprised by how absurdly popular, for example, the Keystone XL pipeline is in the United States. So as you can see from this chart, in the United States, the Keystone XL pipeline is favored by 75% of Americans. So that makes a proposal to put a steel pipe in the ground and run oil through it more popular than almost any US politician, which is a little bit shocking, but what it indicates is the opposition to Keystone XL and the scrutiny on the oil sands is coming from those small groups on the far right of that chart. So all the people that think greenhouse gases are a problem, we should have some more regulation of them, we should have marginally more regulation, they already support the Keystone XL pipeline. The opposition is really driven by the groups that are looking to cut all these sources down to zero as quickly as possible. Well, then you might wonder, if that's the case, still I don't understand why they would focus on such a small source of emissions when they could focus on these bigger issues like coal emissions. And the answer there is that those environmental groups have discovered it's very difficult politically to go after that coal power groups in the United States or China. There are already infrastructures and societies built up around that coal power. On the other hand, the oil sands is an area of increasing production. And so those environmental groups have found that it's easier to target new production, new infrastructure, new pipelines that don't yet have a built-in set of supporters. And you can see this evolution in the environmental groups' thinking in which projects they protest at climate protests, climate marches, et cetera. So in 2009, most of the climate protests were focused on coal, getting rid of coal. But environmental groups didn't have as much success with that as they wanted to. So by 2011, they'd switched to focusing on the Keystone XL pipeline. By 2014, we had the biggest climate march of all time in New York this year. And at that march, the number one thing that protesters were going after was fracking. Now that's both revealing and ironic because fracking, of course, has reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the United States because natural gas has displaced some of that coal, which was otherwise emitting so much. But it makes sense when you realize those environmental groups are not looking for a marginal reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. They're not happy going just to natural gas instead of coal. They're looking to cut all these emissions down to zero. And what fracking and pipelines, or the oil sands, have in common is that they're new sources of increased production. And environmental groups think that's their opportunity for actual progress on eliminating fossil fuels. So many of you have seen some version of this graph that shows projections for increased production from the oil sands and the need for pipelines. You can see them stacked there on top of each other. New pipeline proposals, Keystone XL, the Trans Mountain expansion, Northern Gateway, Energy East. When environmental groups look at that, they say those are opportunities because we might not be able to shut down coal plants, but those pipelines we might be able to stop. So it's a target of opportunity for them, and that's why it's only likely to increase. Well, this focus of environmental groups on new production from the oil sands has had a drastic impact on how environmental impact assessments are done in the United States. So, as most of you will know, there have been 6 years of review of the Keystone XL pipeline and what it may or may not do to oil sands production in Canada. That's been the basis that President Obama said his decision will be made on, is will it increase greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands? So that application for the Keystone XL pipeline went in 2008, 6 years ago. What I think people sometimes forget is that in 2008, the United States approved the original Keystone pipeline that has a little bit of a more easterly route, and they were also in that same environmental impact assessment, they were asked to consider the effect of the pipeline on oil sands production in Canada. And here's everything that they said about oil sands production in Canada in that review. It fits on one slide. The environmental impact statement addresses the environmental impacts of construction and operation of the proposed Keystone pipeline within the US. And it is limited to the pipeline, which is a transportation system. It does not extend to the supply of crude oil to the transportation system. So that original Keystone pipeline was approved by President Bush, but it was defended in court by President Obama successfully. And so you can see that just a few years ago, the norm was it's a pipeline. We don't consider what kind of crude oil is going into it, et cetera. This is, and the fact that we've now had 6 years of review on the Keystone XL pipeline on exactly the issue that was thought irrelevant in 2008 and 2009 is indicative of how much things have changed over just the past couple of years. So how can these foreign regulators, if they're focused on the oil sands, how could they address the oil sands? Well, there's a couple different methods. One is environmental impact assessments of infrastructure approvals, like pipelines. So anything that crosses the border, of course, requires a presidential permit. But there are other kinds of infrastructure that could also be subject to these kind of assessments. So any kind of crude oil loading and unloading facilities, whether for rail or for shipping. So that kind of environmental impact assessment could be expanded to other sources to increase the focus on the oil sands every time a permit is given in the United States. But there's another kind of regulation that's also possible. Life cycle fuel standards. Now there's a couple examples of these, like the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard or the EU Fuel Quality Directive. And what these regulations do is they say, if you're going to send us your oil, if we're going to allow imports of your oil, you have to produce it using low greenhouse gas emissions wherever it's produced and refined. Wherever in the world that it's made. That kind of regulation is potentially a threat to the oil sands because it means oil sands production generally has higher greenhouse gas emissions per barrel of oil produced. So it tends to disfavor the oil sands. And as a result, the Canadian oil industry and the Canadian government has been lobbying, making an aggressive policy case against these regulations in the EU and California, asking for ways to treat oil sands a little bit more favorably, treat it on the same terms as European crude, etc. But in addition to that policy case, and they've actually, I should say that Canada's been able to win some modifications of those standards that make them a little bit more friendly to the oil sands. But in addition to that policy case, there's also a legal case that can be made. Obviously, it seems a little bit strange for California to be telling other countries and producers in other countries how much greenhouse gas emissions they can produce when they're producing oil. So that's a little bit strange. And you might think that that was a problem both under trade law, right, to limit imports based on telling some other country how to regulate, but also potentially for California under constitutional law, because California is not supposed to have an independent trade policy. It's supposed to allow for free trade with other states and other nations. And indeed, the US oil industry has filed a lawsuit against the California low carbon fuel standard saying that it was unconstitutional. Well, they filed that case in California District Court, and the District Court agreed with the oil industry, said California can't tell other states and countries how to regulate, and struck down the standard. But then California appealed that case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which consists of all the western states and is actually, it's the most liberal court in the US. And that court, on a narrow vote, said, well, we want to give a little bit of leeway. We think greenhouse gas regulation is really important. And so we want to give a little bit of leeway to California in adopting this kind of standard. And so they reversed the district court and upheld the standard. At that point, the oil industry said this is a very important case. This was a big case. They petitioned the Supreme Court to take the case. Supreme Court doesn't take very many cases. And the interesting thing that I found in observing that case is that the American oil industry was saying you should take, the Supreme Court should take the case. But the Canadian oil industry didn't file anything asking, saying that they disagreed with the standard, which is a little bit odd because when these standards were adopted, the Canadian oil industry had said, we think these violate trade law, we think they violate constitutional law, but they never filed anything in court with the Supreme Court asking it to take the case. There was, however, one Canadian industry that was willing to speak up for the Canadian oil industry. It might not be who you expect, unless you looked at my title. The foie gras industry filed briefs in the Supreme Court saying, it's totally unfair how you're treating Canadian oil producers. This is what they said. Regardless of how grandiose California's aims may be, the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution, which reserves matters of interstate and foreign commerce to Congress, does not allow this form of extraterritorial regulation. So the Pâté industry's interest is actually relatively clear. After California adopted its low carbon fuel standard, it adopted a standard for production of Pâté that said it had to be cruelty-free production, and like the low carbon fuel standard, applied to producers all over the world. So I get why the Pâté industry was interested in this. Not the interesting question for me is, well, why was the Canadian oil industry not interested? Why were they not going to enter this debate? And when I've talked to people around town, what they typically tell me is, well, we prefer to resolve these things informally. We don't want to make any kind of precedent, and we don't want to appear litigious, which is interesting to me from an American perspective, because I can tell as somebody who is an American lawyer and clerked in the US courts, I can tell you that a US judge, when it looks at this kind of case, would think, well, it seems bad. It seems like California is telling other countries how to produce their oil, but nobody's complaining about it. Nobody's here before me telling me this is a bad idea, so it must not be a big idea. And I realize it's an American idea, but sort of our view is, hey, if you don't sue, you don't care. So the question that I have going forward is this, will the Canadian oil industry need to develop a legal strategy to accompany its policy strategy? So far, as I said, the policy strategy has been relatively successful in terms of winning modifications from the EU and California that treat oil sands a little bit more favorably. But I wonder, now that these California standards have been upheld, other states are looking to follow suit. Are these other states going to be so willing to compromise? And some of these other states are much more crucial to Canadian oil production. California doesn't import very much US oil, but a state like Washington, which is considering a low carbon fuel standard, does import a significant portion of oil from Canada. And then the second issue is whether these life cycle, this view that the life cycle is always relevant, production in other countries is always relevant, is that going to become the new normal in infrastructure projects? Keystone XL is an anomaly in that it's one of the very rare cases where the government has said the broader energy market should be considered when we just consider this infrastructure project, this pipeline. We want to think about both upstream and downstream. If that life cycle appraisal becomes the norm, and the US doesn't apply that in any other context, but if that became the norm, it could have a significant effect on the the Canadian oil industry. And furthermore, it maybe would spread to Canada, where that's one of the biggest issues in the Energy East, the Trans Mountain expansion, and the Northern Gateway reviews, is whether the NEB should consider greenhouse gas impacts. So with that said, I'd like to invite Brenda up here to give us some perspective on how the Canadian industry looks at both these legal and policy challenges, and whether these strategies can be in any way integrated.
Thanks very much, James, and that was an interesting start to the morning, and yeah, we were observing over breakfast that pâté was not served on the menu this morning. I'm not sure whether people were expecting that with the title, but so I have some observations in response to James's comment that I wanted to share, and I think that it's been really helpful to hear the perspectives of a legal scholar with respect to the challenges that we face and how US lawmakers are extending their reach. I think a central issue about this really is about our own expectations in terms of fairness and equivalency and how we intend to get there. What's our history of how we do things in Canada and for Canada? And I believe that if you look at the actual regulations to start with in Canada and in the US, that does tell us a little bit. Generally speaking, in the US, regulations tend to be more oriented toward litigious. They tend to be more rule-based, and they tend to expect that you need to lay out things that are all about challenge. I remember as an NEB staffer years ago being amazed that in 400 staff at the NEB we had 9 lawyers. When I visited FERC, out of 1,200 people, they had about 500 lawyers, and I thought, well, that's a very different regulatory framework. And to James's point, sort of if you don't sue, you don't care in terms of regulatory decision making. It was fully expected all the time. Any given regulatory decision would be sued, whereas at the NEB previously, it's not so much the case now, that was the exception. So certainly Canadian regulation can have rules, does have rules, but it tends, in fact, I think, to be more oriented toward defining the public interest, seeking ways to understand how one would prescribe an outcome and conditions that capture that. And rather than saying if you don't sue, you don't care, I think Canadians would generally think along the lines of if you don't engage, you don't care. If you don't dialogue, if you don't tell me how you're feeling, you don't care. And maybe that's just the way we are. I point to one book by a Canadian philosopher, John Ralston Saul, and the book's name is A Fair Country. If your leaning is a little right of center, I'll warn you that parts of this book will give you hives. But it is an interesting read, more about the history of First Nations in Canada and broad accommodation. But I think the central thesis is that we are a country made up about accommodation and cooperation throughout our history, and I think we see that in our culture very much. So, of course, the clearest way to start any sort of conversation about international cooperation or Canadian decision-making is with good public policy. Here in Alberta, for example, you would have witnessed in the last year or two a significant adjustment to the legal framework for energy regulation, which starts with broadband integrated policy. Big kudos to Alberta for this, because from a sustainable development point of view, integration is what that's all about. And from there, some boundaries for how regulators would move forward. And we have seen some lack of clarity on policy in general with respect to energy, particularly across the country. From an industry point of view, this has been a real problem. And over the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a lot of activity to try to help cajole and define energy strategy. I was involved early on a project with 3 other major hydrocarbon associations that worked on the boundaries of an energy framework, involved other stakeholders, invited other forms of energy in, actually solicited work from folks like Sustainable Prosperity, that's a fairly well-regarded but still a very academic climate change group, to describe what carbon policy might look like on that. There is a role for industry leadership to take those first steps to help to lay down the markers of energy strategy. And following, getting those basic principles out, the Energy Policy Institute of Canada came along and put that to the next level, and then the energy ministers adopted it, and now the premiers have actually signed on to a broad framework for an energy strategy. And some of you in this room may have been involved with that journey. I know one person here, Max Feldman, was our board chair at CEPA for a couple of years in the early stages of this as well. So this framework now, from a policy point of view, in good Canadian style, has been finally signed on by all provinces, and includes things like a commitment to reduce GHG emissions, a commitment for responsible development, a commitment to build pipelines and other means of moving energy, and addressing Aboriginal consultation. And embedded in our laws now is environmental assessment, early stage decision making. And I can tell you, from a pipeline industry point of view, we've had debates at our board table about, would you rather sort of advocate for a situation where policy first says, gosh, we need market access for this country to work, and then we'll figure out the environment. And in fact, I can tell you without exception, our executives all said, no, we need to know that that environmental assessment was done early stage, embedded in the kinds of things we talk to stakeholders about, embedded in what we take to regulators, and decisions will include the outcomes of that. So I'm sharing those examples because clearly it is very tricky to get absolute aligned policy that's balanced, but we really need that. And for Canada to be successful, right now we're seeing some real challenges, clearly, with respect to some of our tidal provinces, if you will, and various conditions set forth, including the latest from both Ontario and Quebec with respect to 7 conditions, including, in their case, a similar kind of expectation to that which the State Department is playing out right now on show me that these developments will not increase overall GHG emissions in the country. One can react to that in our own federation as a roadblock. I prefer to look at it as an invitation. I think our Premier in Alberta sees it in a similar fashion and is there today to meet with various other counterparts, and I'm very hopeful that we will find a path for mutual interest. So I'm going into this because I think the problem that we face ultimately is we will never get to social acceptance through a project-by-project, very litigious approach. I think we really do need to have a viewpoint that is largely about general agreement on the path forward, and then clear decision-making and clear understanding of the rules at the project level, but it needs to be framed within that overall policy. So I'm concerned in Canada today, and when I look extraterritorially, that these pipeline battles have adopted a very litigious approach. We are adopting and sliding into thanks to, I think in part, very, very active, aggressive American-style activism, which is helpful in raising the debate, not helpful in how that it denigrates the public space and actually polarizes the opportunities, and in fact builds deep skepticism. In fact, some of those tactics are very directly oriented toward that explicit outcome. We've surveyed Canadians and find that when asked, do you trust the regulator to safeguard your interests? Only 1/3 say yes. And that is a very, very dangerous place to be in a country where we have traditionally counted on peace, order, and good governments, and we have traditionally counted on accommodation and trust. So even though across the full life cycle of projects and energy developments, spanning several generations at any given turn, there is continual improvement, and we need to get better as we go along. But we do have a real challenge ahead. And I'm saying this because the challenge that we face, if we go down the route of solving everything from a litigious lens, what we will find is that it automatically becomes also very politicized, because a law is only lasts as long as a given party is in power and can easily be changed. And if you're rocketing back and forth between pro and against, as opposed to a fabric of general agreement on where we're heading, we have a problem. I would also put forward to you that one of our greatest opportunities for competitive advantage going into the next century in Canada, where we know we will live in a challenging world, there will be carbon constraint, there will be overpopulation, there will be strife, there likely will be war, etc. Our Canadian ethics and values, this ability to actually collaborate and accommodate, is, I think, one of our strongest opportunities in the century ahead for our governments, for our industries, and for our society overall. So why I sort of dwell on this is because, you know, the invitation, I think to some extent, James is right, we shouldn't be patsies, and I think we do have a role to stand up more aggressively in international courts and to tackle these extraterritorial things. But at the same time, here at home, I think we need to work really hard to build the avenues for better listening and better reach into something that becomes trustworthy. What I have seen in dealing with executives in our industry and in the upstream is a deepening understanding for those who have a sophisticated strategy that our best approach has to involve two-way dialogue, and we have to listen openly to the concerns being expressed by the majority of folks. I'm not talking about trying to accommodate toward a relatively minor, highly vocal group, as legitimate as their voice is. Polling will tell you uniformly that's about 10% of Canadians. There are about 50% of Canadians who say, I kind of get it, but I have some questions, and I really want the respectful opportunity to be heard. I think that's very reasonable and eminently Canadian. Now, for those of you who are law oriented, I would point back. I'll steal. I know I'm supposed to be here for industry, but I can't help, talking to an academic group, draw back a little bit to one slice of academia, and that has to do with something called reflexive law. There are legal instruments that understand that a fixed rule actually is not very effective where you're dealing with things that are dynamic and that you need to be able to adapt. And I think nothing comes higher on that order than understanding where we're at with energy and environment. The word reflexive just means challenge your own assumptions. Whether you're in business and you listen to Peter Senge and double loop learning, or whether you're in law and you know what I mean by reflexive law, we need to be able to form a frame of reference jointly. We need to understand what's fair together. We need to encourage continuous improvement. In our industry, we're doing that through something called SEPA Integrity First, which is a very aggressive approach for continuous improvement on safety and performance on the environment. But we're doing that by engaging an external advisory panel, by being more transparent, by outreaching across various regions in Canada and asking people, what do you care about? We're not leaving it just to the engineers to define what our safety program is. We're actually integrating into our materiality analysis what's in the hearts of people as well as in the design for safety. And that gives us optimal solutions and ultimately trust. Because without trust at the end of the day, a win on a court challenge will be a one-time win in a battle, but we will never win the war, so to speak. So we need to be able to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. In conclusion, we have to set our own way. Let's not abandon what gives us our greatest strengths in Canada as we move forward. Let's not accept a litigious approach as the only way through what we're facing in the coming years. But at the same time, as we step up and not step back, let's make sure that we do stand up for ourselves in some of these court challenges and make sure that our principles of fairness, equity, and honesty and integrity are very, very clear every step of the way.
So, James, my first question was, you mentioned that California was really the canary in the mine, right? So what U.S. states should Canadian companies be monitoring and be concerned about?
There's two ways in which you might be concerned. I think the first question is for further precedence for this. So if there are states that are doing this in other circuit courts, I think it would be particularly important to have a Canadian voice heard in those forums, because particularly if two different circuit courts go the different ways, that's the kind of case that's most likely to end up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might be much more likely to accept that case and potentially overturning this Ninth Circuit decision in that case. The other kind of concern that you might have is about which states are importing the most Canadian crude. So for now, that would be mostly those Midwestern states where these kind of standards might be a big problem. But of course, oil markets are changing too. Part of the point of Keystone XL is to get that Canadian oil down to the Gulf Coast. So that might be another place to look as well. I wouldn't be too concerned about Texas or Louisiana adopting a low carbon fuel standard, but so maybe Illinois and Washington are the ones that you'd be worried about immediately.
Okay, I have actually one other question. I've always thought of James as a semi-Canadian because he was raised in Minnesota. So I thought, yeah, that was close enough to the border. He kind of gets us. Do you see a difference between the Americans and the Canadians in the values they hold about the environment?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing, this was the polling I cited. I'm not sure if you saw, but on that poll it showed that the Keystone XL pipeline was actually 10 percentage points more popular in the US than in Canada. And that's actually been a relatively consistent result. And one of the, another polling result in that, which is relatively consistent, is that when you ask Canadians, if they had to choose, do they choose the environment or the economy? Canadians are much more likely than Americans to say the environment. For most people in the US, the environment is kind of way down the list of priorities. And actually, I think that's a big opportunity for Canada. And some of the things that Brenda was talking about with a place like Alberta that has a real, that is so invested in the energy industry, but where there's a real concern about environmental issues, in a lot of ways has a role to play in terms of being a model for US states like North Dakota and Texas, where they have the energy industry, but the concern for environment is not so much there. I'm not sure if you saw the New York Times articles that have been on North Dakota fracking in North Dakota recently, but I think the chief environmental regulator in North Dakota was quoted as saying, well, I'm not much of a regulations guy. So I think Alberta, in some ways, in terms of has a real opportunity to be a place that shows how to integrate those concerns about the environment with continuing development for the energy industry.
Okay, so Brenda, I'm going to move to a question for you. I've heard three players identified in terms of the Canadian playing field. So one would be our own premier. The other is the industry association, and the other would be the individual CEO of different pipeline energy companies. how do those three play together so that we can have a common voice? Because I think that's what you're saying, give us a strength.
Well, yeah, and I think naturally they're accountable to execute and accountable to citizens and stakeholders. So it is a little more complicated than just those three. But looking at those three, I think that the first step is for industry leaders to recognize where their competitiveness is actually playing out. Very natural and logical tendency is to believe that your competition comes from eating the lunch of your neighbor, and if you grow, it's by stealing his market share or what have you. In fact, in today's world where there's so much above ground risk, the size of the whole pie is probably a bigger growth risk or prospect than the nibbles on sizes of the slice of the pie. So to that end, first step is understand that there's a huge amount of competitive advantage, often achieved through collaboration. They're not an oxymoron. In our industry, in pipelines, for several years now, our guys have consistently said, we do not compete on safety. So they'll come into our boardroom, you know, having had a drag-em-out fight on a number of market access issues, but in that room, a very congenial, solid, roll up the sleeves, let's get her done, because anybody's spill is everybody's spill. And we need to be equally credible and equally accountable. Within our program of Integrity First, for example, we're moving in 2015 to things like conditions of membership, third-party verification, disaggregated company by company reporting. That's at the request of those CEOs. Now, how that impacts the association is our role is to create the ability to convene, to drive out performance, and to be able to voice that transparently and clearly. Why that matters to the Premier and or his Deputy of Energy and or regulators is because if industry is responding in that fashion, you have something you can piggyback and pull along. We should all have one set of performance metrics for upstream performance, for pipeline performance, et cetera. There's no reason for regulators to be monitoring one thing and companies to be monitoring another. It confuses the public, it undermines trust and confidence, and it distracts where we should be focused. I think the Premier's role is to basically, you know, set the marching orders. When our Premier comes out in a few weeks or a month with a new framework on how Alberta will perform to be responsible, to achieve our overall sustainability outcomes in order that our province can thrive. The response from CEOs and associations needs to be, how can I make that happen? And then how can I work with regulators to give them the confidence that I am responding? Finally, quickly, and this part is not quick, but engage stakeholders. So again, on pipelines, for example, one of the members of our external advisory panel is a US citizen who has been a safety transparent zealot. Carl Weimer runs Pipeline Safety Trust, has done so for a decade, and they're miles ahead of us in Canada. So we were thrilled that Carl was willing to come up from Bellingham and sit on our EAP and tell us what transparency means. We need to reach out and be open to those constructive critics. Don't get thrown off by the few dropping bombs on your doorstep. Those folks will do what they do. They are not voicing a constructive path forward, but we do need to engage critics and listen well.
Thank you, Brenda and James. We have very small tokens of thank you for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a couple of things I want to bring up. If you want James's PowerPoints, there is a QR code on the back of the red card at your table. And so if you hit that QR code with your phone, you will get the PowerPoint slides. And I look forward to seeing you on February 12th. Thank you.